first in March 1919 when Kolchak's forces advanced, then in October 1919 when Denikin's forces advanced from the south and Udenich's forces advanced from the Baltic. At those moments, it looked like the Reds were going to lose the Russian Civil War. In fact, as early as August of 1918, when the foreign forces first intervened in the Russian Civil War, some Bolshevik leaders said, our state, our infant state, is like a corpse just waiting to be buried. Their forces at that point were so weak. By 1919, Trotsky has built up a new Red Army, and it was able to defeat the whites in the Russian Civil War. Why? What's the most important factor, or two most important factors? Geopolitical, strategic factor is the Reds have the interior lines of communication. They occupy the industrial heartland of the former Russian Empire. The arms factory at Tula is under Bolshevik control, whereas the whites occupy the periphery of the former Russian Empire. And they're based often in areas, the Georgians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, who are in conflict with the white Russians' objective of reunifying the entire Russian Empire. So why is it that the Reds win? Well, one factor is that the white enemies are not united. And when Kolchak attacks in the spring of 1919, Denikin is not ready for his major push. And by the time Denikin makes his major push in October of 1919, Kolchak's forces have been driven back in Siberia. So there's one factor to think about. They were surrounded, they almost lost, they survived. This has a formative impact on Soviet Russia, on the Soviet government, on Bolshevik leaders thinking. Let's go back to the end. So the first point is about encirclement. And second point, enemies of the Bolsheviks not united, not well coordinated. The whites are based in the borderlands of the former Russian Empire, therefore Estonians are not so happy about having a monarchist who wants to reintegrate the entire former Russian Empire based in their territory, attempting to attack Petrograd, which would eventually become Leningrad. And as we talked about before, the United States supports independence for Poland and Finland, but favors the unity of the rest of the former Russian Empire. Any questions? Yes?
Well, what was that drawing for? Like, who was meant to see it? Why was it drawn?
There wasn't a lot of information in the folder where I found it. So this is a white Russian officer drawing the map at the time. Maybe he was using it to explain to audiences in the United States what the situation is, but the lettering is Russian, so I don't know how he was using it. But I think that that's one of the more valuable illustrations I've found, that better than just a map, it actually is his depiction of the military situation at that time. Okay, let's so here's the outline. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So Woodrow Wilson is a central figure for our discussion. So I think it's appropriate that we start by examining what do you know about Woodrow Wilson, and how does his background, worldview, philosophy influence his policies eventually with regard to the Russian Empire. Yes?
Well, he was a son of a priest, a minister.
A minister.
Which shapes his view. In Reconstruction, he was in Atlanta when it was burned, from what I understand. And then he went on to be a professor.
Eventually a professor at Princeton. Yeah, what becomes
And
Princeton
then he becomes
University.
president.
Of Princeton University,
And then
governor of New
governor.
Jersey, and then president of the United States. But so let's start with the first fact, that he's born in Virginia, raised in the South,
It was during
in
the
the
Civil
Deep
War.
South. During the Civil War, he's a young boy. During Reconstruction, he's a teenager. What's the formative impact, and how would that then have some bearing on talking about the Russian Empire and the Russian revolutions and Civil War? I think what's most important is that, although that's a very different context, it is a civil war, it is a period of political turmoil, and for him it's distressing. And it gives him a discomfort with chaos, disorder. And in particular, under Reconstruction, it's a revolution, an overturning of the established order in the South, that blacks should be in power now. that would be the next slide, I think, that I've got up here for you. So the Birth of a Nation, which is first screened in 1915, is screened at the White House before it's generally released. The writer who wrote the novel, The Klansman, which is the basis, was a personal friend of Woodrow Wilson, had studied with him at Johns Hopkins. Okay, so he is a white supremacist. And he believes that blacks are not just not ready for civil rights, but that they are incapable. So on the one hand, Wilson will say, all peoples, he tended to speak in universalistic language, he would say, all peoples can be made fit for self-government. But he didn't really mean that. When he intervenes in Haiti and the Dominican Republic in 1915 and 1916, it is not with the objective of bringing democracy to Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So what is the relevance of this? There is a tension in Wilsonian foreign policy between the idealistic, universalistic principles that I think people remember Wilson for, and his racial views, which I think Americans tend not to remember as strongly, but they are still important because that limits his perspective of where the principle of self-determination should be applied. The Filipinos, they can be made ready for self-government. It may take 3 generations, but they can be made fit for. The Mexicans, maybe, he thought at some points, they're even more advanced than the Filipinos. And with his guidance, with his teaching Latin Americans to elect good men, they can be made fit for self-government. What about the Russians? How would his racial outlook affect the Russians? If you read the first couple of chapters of my book, you have some information about the background that would be useful for thinking about this. We're talking here about African Americans. What's the connection to Russians? In the discussion in the United States about Russia, how were African Americans and Russians linked in the late 19th century going up to 1917?
I found that, like, originally there was the idea that Russia was too backward to have democracy, but then it became the reason to bring democracy over time. So, like, they could be capable of something.
So that's a transition that takes place in the late 19th century gradually. And who is the key figure who promotes that change of views? George Kennan the Elder. Not the George F. Kennan that is going to come up later, I think, in your program when you talk about containment and the Cold War, but George Kennan the Elder, distant relative. You had your hand up. What were you going to add?
That they maybe connected them with the freedmen, slaves, the peasants that had been emancipated.
Okay, so and there is an important connection there because Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs in Russia in 1861, 2 years before Lincoln promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States. And Americans were very much aware of that. Americans were very much aware that there is a czar liberator in Russia and that there is an emancipating president inside the United States, that Lincoln and Alexander, they're often depicted side by side. So if the serfs are capable, and if the African Americans are capable, then we're moving along the parallel track. But what happens if you're a Southerner and you believe that actually African Americans do not deserve the right to vote, are not capable, are too ignorant, are too easily misguided, misled? So Russophiles inside the United States applied that perspective then to Russians and said, are you kidding me? 70% or 80% of the Russian population is ignorant, illiterate, drunken peasants. They're not capable of orderly self-government. What they need is enlightened guidance by a czarist government that is dedicated to gradually, very slowly moving Russia into the modern world. So that's a framework of authoritarian modernization. We, white Protestant Americans, are capable of orderly self-government, but there are lots of races out there who are either never going to be capable of self-government or who require long-term guidance by their betters in order to be made fit for self-government. So there's a point here about how do you think about the background as Wilson looks at developments in Russia. On the one hand, he has this idealism that maybe the Russians can be made fit for self-government. On the other hand, there's an anxiety that, well, what if the Russians, the saying in Russian is "темный народ," the dark people. Well, the darkness is not in their skin color, but in their minds, the cloudiness in their minds. Are they really capable of orderly self-government? In the midst of the Russian Civil War, John Foster Dulles, who would be important in 20th century American foreign policy later, in the midst of the Russian Civil War, John Foster Dulles was working for the War Industries Board, and therefore he was supervising the transfer of supplies from the United States to support the anti-Bolshevik forces in the Russian Civil War. John Foster Dulles notes in his diary at the time of the Paris Peace Conference that the idea was being pushed to present to Wilson that Kolchak, the admiral in Siberia, was Russia's great white hope. So you see, there's races there in the background, and you have to, I think, tease out, well, so how does this influence how Wilson observes the Russian Civil War? Tracy, what were you going to ask?
Yeah, I was going to add that I've looked at a lot of the white propaganda from the Russian Civil War period, and it actually is quite similar to that cover of the book. I'm not sure if you move it in that direction, but a lot of it has the Ritsar, the Russian knight, rearing in his horse, protecting the homeland. Just an interesting parallel there between this image of kind of protecting the order, and then what the whites would show. And I hope I'm not preempting or your next slide.
Yeah. So how many of you have seen the movie Birth of a Nation? So at the climax at the end, the Ku Klux Klan rides in on their horses and rescues tries to rescue. Actually, she commits suicide. Right? She jumps off the cliff to avoid being raped by a black man. But the Ku Klux Klan rides to rescue. Well, how? I mean, that's 1915. That's just being shown in American theaters in the preceding years. How does that kind of background influence Wilsonian thinking? Particularly when Wilson has people like William Judson, a military attaché, reporting back to him that all hell is breaking loose, chaos is breaking loose in Russia. And the problem stems that we have a population here in Russia that is as ignorant as plantation Negroes. Yes?
Wilson's probably were the common held opinions about things at the time. I mean, the idea of white man's burden, the idea of being a Southerner by birth, he saw the failure of Reconstruction, the feeling that maybe he could do it better. The idea that he was divinely inspired, like the way McKinley was, that God led his hand and his pen and either signed or vetoed legislation. He had a chance to implement this and put this into practice, and we see it here and in other imperialistic ventures that America was involved in.
Wait, yeah, your name is?
Gene.
Gene mentioned divinely inspired. Well, that's where we're going next. So let's move forward and talk not just about race, but let's also talk about religion. So Presbyterian, I think one of you already mentioned, he's the son, I think it was over here, was son of a Presbyterian minister who trained Wilson, raised Wilson with the idea that Wilson, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, his son, would also be a minister. And how is that important? Well, I think one of the most important ways is that Wilson develops a real gift for oratory, for speaking. And he can give the most inspiring, idealistic exhortations that exert an enormous influence on American public life. And it's a messianic language, underpinned by religious notions about America having a divine mission. So it's not just, as Gene says, that Wilson is himself one of the elect who has been divinely called to a mission, but that he's leading the United States to fulfill its historic mission, which is not to remain isolated,